My name is Dustin Messer. I'm a pastor at All Saints Dallas. Once a week or so, we talk with an outside guest to help us think more clearly about God, His Word, and His world. Today, we're going to be talking about religious liberty, and we're joined by Tim Dieppe. I may be saying that incorrectly, but Tim.
That's correct. That's correct.
Excellent. We're off to a great start. Tim directs public policy at the Christian Concern, a legal organization in the United Kingdom. Tim, before I ask you questions relating to religious liberty and your work at Christian Concern, I wonder if you just tell us a little bit about how you came to faith in Jesus and your life there in England.
Sure. Yes. Well, thank you very much for having us on, Dustin. Really nice to connect with you and to share like this about our work. So I grew up in a Christian family that went to church regularly, becoming less common these days, but that was the environment that I grew up in. And I learned a lot of Bible stories that way. But if you'd asked me as a young teenager, what does it mean to be a Christian? I think I would have said something like trying to be good at going to church. That was kind of as much as I understood of the gospel. And it wasn't until I was at a sort of evangelistic event of some kind, and people presented the gospel for the first time to me and explained that the reason Jesus died on the cross was for our sins, and that he took the penalty and paid the price for us, and that I needed to invite him and ask for forgiveness and so on. And it all kind of connected in my head. And I thought, oh, wow, this makes sense. This is what it's all about. I get it now. Why has nobody explained this to me before? And I made a commitment at that point and experienced God for myself at that point. But quickly gave up on it, partly because there's no real follow-up and partly because I had no real apologetic kind of defense for Christian beliefs. And lived most of my teenage years as a fairly convinced atheist. And sort of lived that way and even believed that free will was an illusion and that kind of thing. But really very deep down, I knew that I'd experienced something. And when I was able to get hold of apologetic materials and ask some questions who thought about these things for defense of the faith that made rational sense, then I was able to integrate that and believe it and accept it and enthusiastically promote it as the truth, which is where I'm at now.
Yeah, wonderful.
In a very short nutshell. Yeah.
It's a great nutshell. I'm going to ask you questions about religious liberty and the threats to religious liberty, specifically maybe in England. But before that, what is religious liberty, and why should someone who lives in a pluralistic society and is happy to do so, is happy to have good Muslim neighbors or good Hindu neighbors or what have you, why should we care about, or what is religious liberty and why should we care about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I just read Andrew Walker's book about religious freedom. I don't know if you've come across that book. And it's talking about how Christians and why Christians should promote religious freedom for everyone. And religious freedom is really about the freedom to worship how you want to worship, or worship the God that you want to worship. And the state not encroaching on that, and the state not stopping you worshiping God how you want to. And it's basically about being able to follow your conscience when it comes to religious matters. Christians should promote that because we believe that God has given people freedom, ultimately, to choose how they worship. Worship of God is not to be coerced. If it's coerced, it's not really true worship. So we should be against coercing people to worship God in any way. And we should want to persuade people to worship God and argue and defend worshipping the true God, but allowing people to make their own choices as God has done, and leaving God to judge at the end of time, or when people die, as he will do in that way. And so, religious freedom is very, very important. It's viewed as one of the most fundamental freedoms. If you don't have religious freedom, where do you get other freedoms from? And of course, actually, Christianity has perhaps got the best record in promoting religious freedom. It goes right back to the Church Fathers. It predates the Enlightenment in terms of people like Tertullian and Lactantius defending religious freedom. In fact, Tertullian was the first person in the world, I think, to ever use the phrase religious freedom. And so it's a very long Christian heritage of defending religious freedom for everyone. And Christian societies are best for everyone in that kind of respect.
Yeah. And before asking about threats to religious liberty, maybe a good question would be about liberty more broadly. I think there was a theory 50 years ago that as nations became more and more wealthy, take China for example, as China became more wealthy and they developed more of a stable middle class, that of course freedom would expand. It's, you know, our few presidents ago here in America famously said, liberty is the
Mhm.
desire of every human heart. Some people would say, well, the jury's still out in China. You know, there are protests happening right now for people demanding more freedom and so forth. But I think we can say 50 years on from those sort of predictions, we're all wealthier, and yet freedom is still under attack, and there still are real threats to freedom. Why is that? Why haven't we become more free as we've become more wealthy?
Well, and that is true not just in China and other countries, but it's also true in the West. As you want to come on to England in a minute, but you know, it's not like we've become poorer, but we have abandoned our Christian heritage, and have we, as we have, freedoms have declined. So I don't think it is linked to wealth. It's ultimately linked to ideology, isn't it? And the view of the government or those in power about how free people should be to worship or not worship, and how well disposed they are towards Christianity and people conscientiously following Christian principles and Christian morals and proclaiming Christian morals and Christian principles, and or not. And clearly the Chinese government feels to an extent threatened by Christianity. Otherwise, why would they clamp down on it? And they feel that Christianity, you know, somehow threatens their ideology and their way of life. And that's a shame, because I don't think it does actually. And I think, you know, Christianity will be good for China and would benefit the Chinese government if only they welcomed it and allowed it to flourish well. It would actually be good for society. But they don't view it that way. They view it as a threat. And there's a spiritual battle around as well, isn't there? There's a demonic element to it as well, that Christianity often gets singled out. And Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world today. And let's not forget that. And it's much worse in many other countries than it may be in England.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because there is kind of a probably Marxist kind of way of approaching the world that says, well, you know, there's a substructure that's all material and physical, and look, as people get more money and that kind of thing, these ideas will sort of take care of
Yeah.
themselves or whatever. And the opposite is true, as you say. Ideology, religious forces,
Yes.
these worldview type questions have massive impact on the production of wealth and so forth. And wealth on its own won't fix the problem. So let's talk a little bit about the problem specifically in the West. What are the threats to religious liberty today look like? Because I would bet they look different than they did 50 years ago, 100 years ago. What are the current threats to religious liberty?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's very increasing intolerance towards Christians, particularly in the area of sexual morality in the West, and particularly in the UK, is where I can talk from experience about. But since the legalization of same-sex marriage, you know, the legalization of it makes a big difference, and culture then feels that that is the norm and feels that that is right and appropriate, and then, you know, starts to not tolerate criticism of same-sex marriage or indeed same-sex relationships. So we've had a number of people who've lost their jobs or their positions for criticizing elements of sexual behavior or sexual morality, whether it's street preachers on the one hand who are accused of being homophobic. That's not a crime, you know. Even if they're often able to provide video evidence that all they were doing was quoting the Bible. A recent case actually was quite disturbing just this last week, of a street preacher who did quote the Bible to a female couple of lesbians, who then complained to the police that he's homophobic. The police should have left it at that. I mean, you know, who cares that someone complains about what he said? But they didn't. They arrested him, and then they charged him with hateful speech. And the Crown Prosecution Service, which is like the government's legal agency here in the UK, argued that portions of the Bible should not be read in public and would be a criminal offence if they were. Now that's very, very shocking. Now, it didn't actually get to court, this case, because the two weren't involved. Yeah, backed down and couldn't be bothered taking it to court. And they couldn't be persuaded to bring evidence against the preacher. But the fact that the Crown Prosecution Service, in a legal argument, said portions of the Bible should not be read in public, is very concerning. And then we've also had cases of teachers, particularly in schools. There's a real battle over sex education and the sexualization of young children with promotion of gender ideology, and also the whole LGBT thing. And a number of teachers, when they've criticized that or raised questions about it, one in particular, Christy Higgs, posted on her own personal Facebook account some concerns about sex education in her son's school. And one of her Facebook friends, reported to the school where she worked, actually a different school, which dismissed her for gross misconduct, just for sort of posting concerns on her private, well, not private, but her personal Facebook account about that. Now, that's very concerning. You could lose your job for expressing dissent with prevailing morality. I mean, that's basically all it was that she did. And we're taking that case to court, and she lost actually in the first round, but we're going to appeal that decision, and we'll see where it goes. And then, other cases of people, today I was talking to a chap who was told by a hospice service who works as a chaplain, you can't wear this little cross, a little half-inch lapel kind of cross that he was wearing. And they pushed him very, very hard at it. It might offend someone. That's kind of the thing here. There's no actual person who's been offended, but it might offend someone. And in the end, he said, well, if that's the case, I obviously can't work here. But we didn't, he didn't leave it at that. And we helped him write a letter to the hospice provider, and they ended up backing down and apologizing and saying, no, it's not that you can't wear a cross. They were wrong to say that to you. But the fact is that people believe that it could be said is kind of the issue here. And then, if you're talking about threats, Dustin, I mean, I think, the banning conversion therapy is in the air here in the UK. You're probably aware of this kind of thing in the States as well. Here in the UK, there's been a government consultation on proposing to ban conversion therapy. Now, the government here agreed that any physical act carried out in the name of conversion therapy is already breaking the law. So you don't need any new laws for any physical acts. So what are you talking about? You're talking about criminalizing certain types of consensual conversations, because that's what therapy is. It's a consensual conversation between two people. And if I want to talk about unwanted sexual attractions of some kind or another, or talk about maybe questioning my gender identity, if I want to have that conversation with you, you'd be risking a criminal offense by engaging in that conversation if this becomes law. Now, that's very concerning for Christians who uphold traditional sexual morality, and who believe that, and it's true, many people have changed sexuality. Many people have moved out of it, moved away from it. Many people have been helped by conversations or prayer or pastoral conversations or whatever it might be that could become a criminal offence here in the UK before very long. And there's a lot of pressure to bring in a new law along these lines, and we're waiting to see what the response to the government consultation is on that. So there's kind of a few examples, Dustin. I could carry on if you want, but I mean,
I'm sure you could. You mentioned conversion therapy. I think sometimes what happens in these sort of conversations is people start talking about maybe what is wise. And there are examples in this country, I don't know about in England, where you hear stories of quote unquote conversion therapy from 30 years ago that were just kind of awful. We could maybe even say abusive situations. But when people talk about conversion therapy, you just said voluntary counsel from a priest who holds a traditional biblical sexual ethic.
Yeah,
could be considered, and is considered, in fact, is my understanding in England, quote unquote conversion therapy. So I think it's really helpful to sort of disaggregate and say, okay, so what are we talking about, number one? And then number two, what, even if as a Christian, I may say, for example, I may think, I'll bake cakes for anybody. I don't ask what the occasion is or so forth. That's what I personally would do. Nevertheless, when you hear about someone else whose conscience would not let them bake a cake, say for a same-sex wedding, just because you may think, well, my conscience wouldn't be violated by just making a cake and then whatever the occasion is, that doesn't mean that the imposition of law should be such that it is.
Yeah, it should be clarified, just in that case, that the case over here that relates to that with the Ashes Baker case, it wasn't actually just about the cake. It was about the message on the cake. And the message on the cake said support gay marriage. And the legal case that went all the way to Supreme Court here hinged on whether they should be forced to produce something with a message with which they disagreed. That was the point. And it's sort of, and when you put it like that to people, it's like, well, should a Muslim be forced to produce a cartoon of Muhammad? Should a enthusiastic climate change activist be forced to produce some climate change denying literature in some way or other? No, they shouldn't. And so it's kind of like compelled speech in that sense. They had actually served this same homosexual couple before with cakes, but they refused when it came to a cake with a message on it. That was the point with that one.
Yeah, and I use the phrase religious liberty. I think it's perfectly fine. However, my doctoral studies are in Catholic social teaching. There's a Catholic theologian here in America named William Cavanaugh. One of the things he points out is that even using the phrase religious liberty can kind of put you on slippery ground, in that you really are just talking about freedom. And the implication there is that all of life is religious, right? So everything we do has this kind of worldview, religious structure underneath it. And so once you start bifurcating liberty from religion, you've sort of already lost the battle in a way, though it's still a useful concept in my mind. So you talk about going to court. Say something about what Christian Concern and maybe you particularly do to help folks whose religious liberty is being violated.
Yes. So we're quite well known here in the UK, and we get quite a lot of inquiries from people who are running into problems because of their Christian faith, most often in the workplace. What can I say, or what could I do, or if they're requesting this or saying I've got to do this, or my conscience doesn't want me to do this, how can I be helped? And what we will do then is provide advice, and much of that advice is do this or do that, or some of it is here's a letter you could write, or here's something you could say, or here's how you could express how your religious liberties are infringed here, or how this would breach European Convention of Human Rights, kind of things. But sometimes they do end up in court, and it's the tip of the iceberg, but they're the ones that attract the publicity, and it's kind of the tip of the iceberg cases, but they can be very high profile cases as well, and the profile of the cases can help to raise the issue and get the debate in public opinion as well, and get it decided and discussed in the court of public opinion and the public square as well. And we are about trying to defend Christian freedoms here in the UK, and use the elements of biblical based law, which our law was originally based on, and strong freedom of speech. Like, we've had about 65 street preachers here that have been arrested and charged, and every single one of them is being cleared because our laws do protect freedom of speech. The problem now is the police and culture do not believe that. They believe that if you've offended someone, then you must have committed an offence, for example. So this is the kind of thing we do. We also engage in political issues, like we responded to the government's consultation on conversion therapy and many other consultations as well, and we advise our supporters on how to respond in their own right, and we're very often in the media as well, on TV or radio shows, presenting a Christian perspective on things that come up, which is a fantastic privilege and opportunity to do that, as well as in the courtroom and lobbying in Parliament and so on as well. So we see ourselves as kind of like a Christian voice for the church, for Jesus, for presenting Christian moral, ethical values into the public square.
You said the court of public opinion. I have a friend who sort of a mid-level city employee in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he was talking about some of the ways in which he's felt his Christian faith has put him in jeopardy in terms of his job. And I asked him once, is that because everybody is against you and they all think you're crazy, or are they kind of afraid of a mob on the outside? How prevalent is this? I wonder how you would answer that. In England, is when people hear, someone has to take their cross off to enter a place, or someone who's quoting a Bible verse is accused of hate speech, is the general sort of zeitgeist in England, yeah, that's a bridge too far? Or is are the headwinds really against people being faithful in the society?
I mean, I think that society has become intolerant, and I think the reason is that you know racism is something that people obviously are intolerant of, and rightly should be intolerant of. But then it's moved on to homophobia or transphobia or Islamophobia or something like this, and people feel like you can't say that because that's so offensive to even question. You're questioning someone's core identity. You're saying that what they do is wrong, and you will find that particularly the younger generation of people will sort of come down on you and criticize you, and there is a kind of fear as well. I heard recently of a head teacher in a primary school who said to the teachers, "I think we should stop having a sort of head boy and a head girl, because people might find that offensive. So we'll just say head children." Or something like that. Now, how can you be afraid of saying head boy and head girl? How can you be afraid of saying boys and girls? But people are like, oh, it might offend somebody. Somebody might complain that this is transphobic to say boys and girls or something. And it has become a kind of crazy, paranoid kind of society. Somebody might be watching over my shoulder and report me to someone for saying the wrong thing, or for expressing it in the wrong way, or for saying something somebody might have considered offensive. And so, people find that on the end of somebody could find that offensive. Well, there isn't actually somebody who has quite a lot of the time. But there's a kind of paranoia in society about this kind of thing at the moment.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Maybe a good kind of last question to leave this with is, you and I are Christians, and we read the book of Revelation and have immense reason and justification for hope. Perhaps we don't feel very optimistic about the current fate of the West. Nevertheless, we have hope that's rooted in something deeper, I think, than optimism. As you think about these issues in light of your biblical convictions, what gives you hope in the work that you're doing, which I'm sure oftentimes can feel daunting?
Well, to use a phrase that's often used against us, we're on the right side of history. Put it that way. And that's really what gives us hope. We know, we have a very strong conviction that we are speaking, with truth and with truth on our side. And truth on our side means that science and philosophy and sociology and all of this is also on our side when it comes to the benefits of Christian lifestyle, the benefits of Christian morality, and all of that kind of thing. And that one day people will look back and say, how could society have ever thought that children can change gender, for example? How could society ever have thought that it would be right to affirms a child in an opposite sex identity? And we know that we will be proven right on this, and we know that we're standing with God behind us and with truth behind us in terms of contending for truth and rights and righteousness and justice in society, and we consider it a real privilege to do that. And we know that one day we will be vindicated in some form or other, and it might not be before we die, but it will be at some point. And that we have a confidence that God is standing right behind us and giving us these opportunities to that are a real privilege to speak for him.
You mentioned Andrew Walker. Andrew and I were on a panel together at the last Together for the Gospel, and I remember him saying something to the effect that when you go with the grain of the universe, in other words, when you acknowledge reality as it is, you can't fail, and when you go against it, you can't win in the long run. If you've been watching this and you would like to talk more about religious liberty or the Christian faith more generally, I would love to talk with you. My email is dustin@ascdallas.org. Tim, thank you again for taking the time to do this.
Great privilege. Thank you very much.
Go in peace.